Excellent. Hey, it's wonderful to meet you. Thank you for taking a minute out today. I appreciate it.
No problem.
So I want to really kind of do a deep dive into the world of Don Byas and how this idea came about. So take me back to a little bit. I want to get a little bit of a biography on you first. First and foremost, where were you born and raised, and how did the jazz bug get into you?
Well, I was born outside of St. Louis, and I grew up in Sedalia, uh, and played in rock bands, blues bands in Missouri. Uh, but I never heard about Kansas City jazz or jazz of the Southwest until I moved to the East Coast, and I picked up a Count Basie record, and it said, that he had gotten his band got off the ground in Kansas City. So that's when I started paying attention to, some of the musicians that came out of the Midwest. In college, I mean, I didn't know anybody who listened to anything before Coltrane, basically. And so I bought the Smithsonian collection of classic jazz, which is a great collection. It's still in print.
Yeah.
And there was a song on there by Don Byas. It was a live recording and not a studio with him and Slam Stewart. And it blew me away. I'd never heard of the guy. And they're just improvising on Back Home Again in Indiana.
Yeah.
And I said, I got to start collecting this guy. And I did. I bought, several albums, but then I sort of hit a wall. And I wondered, whatever happened to Don Byas? Well, the thing is, uh, he left America in 1946 because he didn't think he was getting the recognition. He was always junior to Coleman Hawkins. So I sort of followed that interest, and I picked it up later, and I decided a couple of years ago, I looked around, it's like, nobody's writing about this guy, and he's a loose ball in an open field. I'm going to pick it up and run with it. So
Yeah. That's wonderful. So, what was the first live jazz show you saw when you got the bug?
the first live jazz show was, well, Duke Ellington came through Sedalia twice.
Wow.
It's he played at the he played at the State Fair building, and he played at my high school. I heard him at the State Fair building. I didn't hear him at my high school, so that would probably be the first real one. But growing up in a little town back then, the little TV stations had their own sort of local programming that mirrored um, national shows. And my first grade girlfriend, her dad was a jazz bassist, and he had a little Tonight Show on Channel 6 in Sedalia. So you could actually, and he'd have somebody come in and play piano, he'd play the bass, and then they'd bring on a guest from like Greenridge or something. It was like, and he didn't have an Ed McMahon, but he was kind of like the Johnny Carson, Jack Parr of Pettis County. So
I've driven through Sedalia quite a bit. I've gone to the state fair. I know about it. I had a an old boss and a good friend of mine that was from Colcam, and he would always talk to me about that festival that happened in the 70s. Do you remember that
mhm.
descended and it turned into kind of a Woodstock for the Midwest?
I completely missed out on that. I was gone
Oh,
by then, but that was all rock.
yeah, but it was pretty magnanimous for that area. I mean, it was like a total
Oh yeah, I
unexpected
mean,
thing.
oh yeah, it was a crisis. I mean,
Yeah.
people were trying to break into your house to use the bathroom and stuff like that. But anyway, so no, but the one festival that's still going out there is the Scott Joplin Festival, and
Yeah.
Scott Joplin, you heard his name when I was growing up, and we all knew a little bit about him. My grandfather took me down to Main Street, walked me by the Maple Leaf Club, what used to be the Maple Leaf Club, and where there is now a historical marker to Scott Joplin. I mean, Maple Leaf Rag was the first gigantic hit in America, and it's interesting that Scott Joplin came up to Sedalia through Texas and played around uh, in in basically whorehouses and bars. That's where the music was played. But I didn't get the connection between ragtime, which always struck me as a bit stiff, and jazz until I bought the Smithsonian collection of classic jazz, which starts out with Scott Joplin.
Yeah.
He's like the father.
I remember that collection very well, and it is a wonderful timeline of jazz and really
Yep.
gives the listener. I mean, the Smithsonian's always good about kind of laying out the historical landmarks, but that collection specifically. So I'm curious in your timeline, how did writing, how did all talk to me a little bit about how you evolved into being a writer and how you actually got to a point where Don was going to be your subject.
Okay. Well, in high school, I was a sports writer for the local paper. And when I got out of college, I thought I wanted to be a reporter, but I found out I was terrible at it because the job of a reporter is to go up to strangers and ask them embarrassing questions. So I sort of, my first job out of college was to be a reporter I'm in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is right in the middle of the state. But I didn't last long. And then I sort of went, drifted around, started practicing law, and about 15 years into the practice of law, I said, what I really want to do is in my spare time. I don't golf, I don't play tennis. I'm going to write a book. So I did write a book about the Red Sox, and then uh, Johnny Hodges was the first subject I fastened on because I loved his sound. I heard him in college. I probably the only guy in my dorm who had a Duke Ellington album, and I fastened on the one voice, his alto saxophone. I said, this guy's great. His tone is great. And then I found out that he was born in Cambridge and he grew up in Boston. And again, nobody had written a book about him, but he was a very important figure in the history of the development of the alto sax. So I sat down. I said, I'm going to do this, and I walked over to the City Hall in Cambridge where I found the birth certificate. And the weird thing was so many people had written about Johnny on the back of albums, and the facts were all over the place. Some said he was born in 1906. Some said 1907. Some said his middle name was Keith. I mean, just complete nonsense in some cases. So I tracked all that stuff down, and I got that done and published by Oxford University Press. And so that was sort of my first leap off the diving board.
I got into sports writing. I wanted to be a broadcaster myself when I was in college. And I had a really rough go in the early go, but I stuck with it. And that's what I thought I wanted to do when I got on the inside. And I went in the locker room for the Royals during the Hal McRae days, the dark, dark Royal days. And I was like, I don't know if I want to do this. And I just kind of got out and I got into other things. And I got into jazz radio later on because I was doing part-time reporting and I interviewed somebody. Anyway, I was just thinking about the parallelisms. Like I decided for probably different reasons to get out, but I've found jazz and I found that world that makes sense to me. And I had no idea that I was opening up Pandora's box when I got into doing jazz radio. How wonderful this community is, how absolutely rich these souls are, and how evolved these musicians are from Duke to Don and all of these guys. There's just such a richness to their tapestry of who they are, not only as musicians, but as human beings. Um, so I'm curious, when did the idea of you actually making this book become something that you said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go after a publisher, I'm going to dedicate my life because it obviously took a lot out of you, a lot of effort to make this book. So how did all that begin?
Uh, well, I had the idea in my mind. I wasn't particularly happy with the publisher who did my book on Kansas City jazz. I mean, they're located in England, so it was kind of an odd thing. Here I grew up in Missouri, and I had to go to England to get a book about Kansas City jazz published. And that distance was, and the editor it was just very tough. And so somebody at the Smithsonian, as a matter of fact, recommended that I contact University Press of Mississippi. And I had a couple of their books. They do a really high quality job in both blues and jazz. And I got in touch with an editor there, and they were receptive. And it's been a very smooth process. But you should look at their catalog if you have an interest in blues and jazz books. They also just came out with a book by a guy named Steve Bowie on Cootie Williams, a trumpeter for Duke Ellington. So, and it's odd because when you're shopping a book around, I mean, you can find uh, 99 publishers who would say that's a great book, but we don't publish that kind of book. So I had to I was like hopping like a frog from one lily pad to another. I mean, somebody would say, well, we don't publish that kind of book, but call the University of Michigan, for example. or we don't do it, but I have a friend at so and so. So I mean, and this isn't something you can just look up, really. I mean, you can search for academic publishers, but you don't really know what they publish until you do a deep dive into like their website. So, for example, with Johnny Hodges, I thought he's born in Cambridge, Harvard's in Cambridge. I'll talk to them, and they have this series about African American culture, and they say we're into diversity, and I just hit a brick wall. I said no, we're not interested. So, but then I call up Oxford, and somebody said you should call up Oxford. So I sent an email, and I got a response back the same day. I said, yeah, we'd love to do that. So it's finding the right publisher for what you're writing.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned Count Basie. I've been doing interviews and really doing a deep dive. We're going to have a 90th celebration on International Jazz Day, April 30th here in Kansas City, and the Count Basie Orchestra is going to come in, and it's going to be a full celebration of his life. And it's just amazing how much he has done for the world of jazz, and it all really kind of was spurned here in Kansas City. In fact, Scotty Barnhart, the leader of the Count Basie Orchestra, told me the first song played on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, hit play, and it was Frank Sinatra and Count Basie, Fly Me to the Moon. So he was the first guy played on the moon. I mean, if there is ever a moment of christening somebody's solidity in the world, in the art form, that's it,
Right, right.
you
Well,
know?
so I check in on what's going on in Kansas City and jazz every now and then, and obviously, Charlie Parker. I mean, I'd never heard of Charlie Parker's connection to Kansas City growing up, but I grew up in the '60s, um, and I was always so I did a survey of like the high school stage bands and what music they played, and I couldn't find anybody, for example, who played Count Basie. I mean, Count Basie was the uh, he, he he was the apotheosis of the jazz of the Southwest that came up from Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, even some from Kansas, which is usually perceived as a square state, and Missouri. All the ragtime, it all congregated in Kansas City during the Pendergast era because he ran the liquor business
Yep.
and he ran the nightclubs. But I couldn't find a single Kansas City high school on either side of the state line who like had a program of Count Basie music. And the same thing here in Boston. I mean, we've got mainly Johnny Hodges, but nobody plays Duke Ellington's music at like high school stage band concerts. I mean, I sat through 4 years of them with my son, and they're playing these guys, just complete non-entities. And I asked the band director, I said, Duke Ellington's greatest soloist came from Boston. Why don't you play some of his music? Because I don't think the parents would like it. I think the parents are the ones who probably would like it. They don't want to
Yes.
hear, yeah,
Yeah.
they don't want to hear like show tunes. Well, maybe some do, but I think they actually can appreciate it. So,
Yeah. It's interesting. During the pandemic in January 2020, I moved to Lee Summit, which is the home of Pat Metheny. And my stepdaughter and my son went to school, and I just never saw any hearkenings to Pat Metheny, any kind of concerts or anything. And he was instrumental coming from Lee Summit and making that sound. I mean, he traveled to Kansas City and was in kind of the cauldron of the city doing it, but his whole roots were in that high school. And I'm always surprised at how
mhm.
these cats begin in these cities and they don't embrace him more. They don't make it more of a part, which is why I think this Count Basie celebration is so seminal. And every year for Bird's birthday in August, we have a week-long celebration, so we memorialize that every year. So, I mean, there's things that are done, but again, like in high schools and in school programs where these young, malleable minds can grab onto it and really hone in not only on the art form, but the regionality of it, you would figure that would be a no-brainer.
Right. So I've been doing a series on obscure local musicians for a web magazine out here, and one of the guys I stumbled upon was Irving Ashby, who was
Yeah.
an early uh, ex proponent of the electric guitar. He played with Nat King Cole, and I'm doing a little research, and I found out that the high school in the town where he was born actually did name their music room, the Irving Ashby Music Room. So he's at least honored to that extent, even though I mean nobody. I mean he doesn't rank up there with the Charlie Christians or even a Pat Metheny. Sometimes you have to die to get famous, and that's the sad part about jazz is when Pat Metheny dies, it'll be all over the place.
Yeah.
Until then, it's kind of like, they don't want to recognize a living human being, and some of them don't want to be recognized. I mean, Duke Ellington, he did not want to be recognized. I mean, he collected a lot of honorary degrees, but at one point somebody put together a book of all of his compositions and gave it to him as a present, and he backed away like, oh my God, this is my legacy. I'm dead now. So you stay on the road, you keep playing, and you keep alive. You probably don't want a monument
Yeah.
to yourself until you're gone.
Yeah, that's true. So how long did this book take? How much research? How much digging from start to finish?
It took me about 3 years, and the hard part was, Don left America in 1946. And, my wife's always saying, can we travel internationally? And I go, no, not unless I'm going someplace to do something. I don't want to, I can get a postcard of the Eiffel Tower and look at that, and that'll satisfy me. But Don left and he went first to France. He sojourned down to Spain and Portugal for a while, then back to France, and then to Amsterdam, and he ended up finding the love of his life. He was like a lot of jazz musicians, he's got a couple of illegitimate kids out there that I tracked down, but I had to go to Amsterdam because that's where he ended his life, and he ended his life, and he settled down, got married, uh, and he lived there for a long time. He found out after a while the problem was, familiarity breeds contempt. So if you're uh, Sonny Rollins coming into Amsterdam to play a concert, but you live in America, that's a big deal
Yeah.
because everyone will go out to see Sonny Rollins because he's a rarity. But if you go there and you live there, you're the dude down the street
Yep.
and they can see you anytime.
Yep.
And so what happened to him was, what happened to Don was he had to take a hometown discount, like they say in sports. They'd say, well, Don, can you come by and play for, $100? And he'd go, no, I won't play for $100. And so he wouldn't play after a while. And so he had to go further and further afield. He was traveling to, Norwegian, the Scandinavian countries, and that takes a lot out of you, and you're gone from your family. So he became kind of a homebody, and so the good news, bad news is when he moved to Europe, he did get the recognition he was craving in America, and he thought he couldn't get because he was number two to Coleman Hawkins. Uh, but his career sort of hit a plateau and never went to the next level. People forgot about him. I mean, you think about, well, they have great jazz labels in Europe, but not in the Netherlands. I mean, the whole time he was over there, which is from 1946 to the end of his life, um, there was only one album produced by a Dutch record label. He could get on French record labels, but that means you got to travel to Paris to the recording studios. So the jazz scene over there it has its outposts, but if you're not in the it's as if like in America, the big recording studios are in Los Angeles and New York for the big labels. Um, and Don was not in the European equivalent of Los Angeles or New York.
Yeah. But I think it brought so many of these musicians, thankfully, comfort to get away from the racism and the rancor that was happening in America to be able to go out there and flourish. I mean, Ben Webster went out there. There was a lot of musicians, even Dexter Gordon went out there for a while. It was like, thankfully, they had a bastion, they had a place that they could go to and feel regular. Because all of those stories, I always think sometimes about the trajectory of Miles Davis, like how much he would have been different if he didn't get beat up um, in front of Birdland for no reason.
Mhm.
And how many of those musicians went through such horrible atrocities? I remember Louis Armstrong. There was a movie on it's on Apple Plus, and it just talks about what he had to go through. And he was such a positive force, but he had to deal with it all the time. So when I think about stories like Don's, there was an outlet, there was a way for them to at least feel like they were a regular human being on this planet without feeling that nasty sting of racism. I mean, they would get adored on stage and get off and be shuttled to the side. It had to be an unbelievably difficult existence.
Um, that's certainly true. On the other hand, Don, he was pestered during his entire time in Europe, did you leave America because of racism? And he said, no, I didn't. I left because, for career reasons. I was in the shadow of Coleman Hawkins. So Don was, I call him a walking UN. He was African American. He was part Cherokee. He was part Hispanic. And there's even some people in his family believe there's a Jewish ancestor somewhere because his father read the Bible in Hebrew. So it's like he didn't take offense because he was a member of so many groups. He also didn't have. I mean, he started his career, playing in Kansas. Um, I mean, in Oklahoma, sorry, and then he went to the West Coast, which even back then probably had a more hospitable racial climate than the Midwest, and so he became very popular in Los Angeles. He was playing with Lionel Hampton, some of the other big name bands out there, and it was just sort of happenstance that he ended up moving to New York because he ran into uh, Ethel Waters, who was a big, I mean, she was kind of the Beyonce of her day. She was a multi-talented actress, singer, and she had a touring show. She had a touring, vaudeville show. And Eddie Mallory was her boyfriend at the time, and he picked Don and Don up, and they moved to New York, and that's when his New York days started. And he rose fairly quickly. He would seek out jam sessions. He'd hang out with his saxophone in a club until, Coleman Hawkins would say, "You want to play, kid?" Kind of like that. And he'd go, "Yeah, I guess so." And this kind of gunsling. I don't know if you ever seen the movie The Hustler.
Yeah.
Like uh, so Paul Newman is Fast Eddie Felson. He goes into a pool hall and he acts like, I'm just a bumpkin, and then so Don would kind of play that role, the disingenuous, guy sitting there saying, "Yeah, I'll play with you," and then he'd, of course, try to cut these guys as they all do, and he succeeded. And eventually, Coleman Hawkins said, so Coleman Hawkins hired him to be in his band, and after a while, he said, "I can't have Don in my band. He makes me work too hard every night."
So yeah, and Coleman's from St. Joseph, Missouri. There's a real local connection there. So let me ask you this: what was the most surprising thing that you learned about Don during this process?
Uh, well, he had an entire other side. I mean, Duke Ellington was a painter. He got a scholarship to art school, didn't do it. So Don had the same thing going on, and so I think that the term is called synesthesia, which is you
Yeah.
hear music as colors, you see colors as music, you translate different mediums in your mind. So Don was, in addition to being, a multi-instrumentalist, he knew piano as well as saxophone. He painted. He was a sculptor. He did woodcuts. He picked up languages very quickly. If you cross the border into, I mean, there's one anecdote where they're on a bus and they're going from, one country into a Scandinavian country, and by the end of the bus ride, he's singing a song that he's made up in the new language. So he has this very fertile mind. I mean, if you think of jazz musicians as narrowly defined, guys who like spend 8 hours a day playing the horn, that's true too. But it's also the fact that, some of these guys have, I forget which is the left side, but the creative side of their brain has just a whole lot of stuff going on.
Yeah. What did you learn about yourself in this process? I mean, the thing about getting into anything, deep diving, you're the one that's going into it, but you're ultimately going to learn something about yourself. What did you learn?
Uh, it's hard to say. So I learned this, which is I think I'm probably through writing about jazz. I mean, this takes a lot out of you.
Yeah.
And I'm looking around, thinking, what am I going to do next? And I've looked at a couple guys. Charlie Hayden one. I mean, it would be interesting for somebody to write a book about him. He started out in Iowa, and he played at a radio station in Springfield, Missouri, in a sort of the house band. Radio stations used to have a house band that would play for their little variety shows, like the one I told you about earlier with the father of my first great girlfriend, who was a jazz bassist. And then he went from Iowa to Springfield and then to Los Angeles, where he hooks up with these free jazz guys. So it's like, and the kind of stuff he was playing in Missouri and Iowa was, it was country,
Yeah.
and he still has that country flavor to him. But I guess I look at the body of his work. Some of it I love, some of it I don't love. And if I don't love it enough, I don't think I could pull it off again. 3 to 5 years, you know, uh, listening to Ornette Coleman, for example. I mean, I don't think I have it in me to do that.
Yeah, for sure. So the book, it's a wonderful read and it's so good. I have a lot of admiration and respect for what you've done with this book. Don Byas, Sax Export. It's University of Press of Mississippi. The best way for them to get it. How can they get it? How can they reach out to you if they want to? Any of the good business, anything else going on in your world?
Uh, the easiest way, because it's an academic publisher, is uh, you can go to the University Press of Mississippi website. Um, the paperback is $30. I'm embarrassed to say the hardback is $100, and it's not worth $100. So uh, I believe there will be an ebook version, but it's available on Amazon. It's available on Barnes and Noble. Uh, I believe there is a function on the University Press of Mississippi website where people can email questions. You can certainly put a comment uh, on on the book on Amazon, for example, and some of those can be pretty tough. I
Yeah,
uh, Duke Ellington fans tend to be very rigid. If you ever get a fact wrong, they will let you know about it.
sure.
But I'll respond to any kind of question that somebody puts in a comment like that. So,
Okay. Excellent. Con, this has been wonderful. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your time. Enjoy that Red Sox game.
okay, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Joe
And
Domino here, host of KC's Neon Jazz Radio. On International Jazz Day, April 30th, join us at the Music Hall in downtown Kansas City for the event of the year, 90 Years of Count Basie's Swing. At 7 p.m., the world-famous Count Basie Orchestra takes the stage. From 5 to 7 p.m., it's a VIP reception with jazz legends and honorees. Finally, from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m., join the after-party jam session at Lonnie's Reno Club inside the Ambassador Hotel. Tickets are moving fast. Get yours now at kccreativecity.com/count-basie. This event is part of International Jazz Day, supported by the UNESCO Creative Cities Network, with Kansas City proudly standing as America's only creative city of music. I'll see you there, Kansas City.